Good evening. My name is Ralph Blauvelt, and I'd like to tell you about my most recent book entitled Bluefields. It was published earlier this year. It is a story of Captain Willem Albertsen Blauvelt. He was a Dutchman who sailed a French ship among the English buccaneers in the West Indies. Are you ready for a swashbuckling good time? Well, I can't promise that, but I will try to keep you awake with some interesting things that I learned while researching Captain Willem Albertsen Blauvelt. But first, we need to clarify some basic ideas and terminology. Let me introduce you to Hugo Grotius. Here he is, or at least the top portion of him. This is a picture of his statue in Delft in the Netherlands. He was a Dutch humanist, diplomat, lawyer, theologian, jurist, statesman, poet, and playwright. However, his work in the field of international law has had a lasting impact. He has been called the father of international law. Tonight, we are interested in the paper he published in 1604, De Jure Praede Commentarius, or translated, the commentary on the law of prize and booty. Now, prize in this context means something taken by force, stratagem, or threat, especially property lawfully captured at sea in time of war. In short, his commentary justified Dutch seizures of Spanish and Portuguese shipping in the global contest to dominate international trade, and the continuing struggle of the Dutch to win their independence from Spanish control. Grotius defended the practice of taking prizes as not merely traditional or customary, but just. His commentary points out that the etymology of the name Ares, the Greek god of war, was the verb to seize, and that, quote, the law of nations had deemed looting enemy property legal since the beginning of Western recorded history in Homeric times. Now, in my description of Captain Blauvelt, I said he sailed among the English buccaneers. Does anyone know what a buccaneer is? Well, most people would say a buccaneer was a pirate in the Caribbean, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. However, popular culture has conditioned us to think of buccaneers or pirates as they are portrayed in movies like Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean, or the character of Long John Silver in the classic Treasure Island. They wore gold earrings and eye patches, neither of which were at all common for the mariners during the so-called golden age of piracy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So let's be a little more precise with our terminology. If piracy is an act of robbery on the high seas, then Willem Albertsen Blauvelt was a pirate. However, in the mid-17th century, when Captain Blauvelt was active, nearly every captain who committed acts of piracy sought out some form of paperwork or commission to provide legitimacy for committing violence upon the high seas. Such a captain was called a privateer, a private person in possession of a legal commission provided by some state or government entity. A pirate, however, acted independently without the sanction of law. Now, this simple distinction was a bit more complicated in practice. In the early British Empire, it was debated whether a colonial royal governor represented the state or not. For instance, could the Jamaica Council send out preemptive commissions, as they did, in times of peace? Governor D'Oyly of Jamaica around 1660 even gave out commissions to the infamous buccaneers who had previously been outright pirates. The original buccaneer were French hunters who used a wooden frame, or boucan, to smoke meat from cattle and pigs on Hispaniola, the island home of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They expanded their activities into piracy, and Governor D'Oyly invited some of them to Jamaica to help defend the island against the Spanish. Eventually, all the pirates and privateers of the West Indies were called buccaneers. During my research, I learned that privateering was an integral part of naval culture in the American colonies during the 18th century. At the outbreak of the American Revolution, patriot leaders like John Adams took it for granted that privateers would serve as a citizen militia at sea. In my book, I relate several stories about pirates and privateering in the American colonies more than 100 years before the American Revolution. One involved a man named Kempo Sabata. Sabata's career as a privateer mirrored that of his compatriot, Willem Albertsen Blauvelt. Like Willem, he was a Dutch mariner who worked for the English Providence Island Company in the West Indies during the 1630s. Both men left the island at about the same time, around 1640, and individually engaged themselves in privateering activities. By the late 1640s, Kempo Sabata was a crew member on Willem Blauvelt's ship, Lagarce. Remember, I said it was a French ship, and the translation of Lagarce in English is what we might call a female dog. In the early 1650s, they both lived in North America. Willem lived in the Dutch colony of New Netherland, and Kempo in the English colony of New England. And then both of them returned to the West Indies around the same time in 1654-55, when the English took over the Jamaican colony from the Spanish, just as the English took over New Netherland from the Dutch in 1664. It was Kempo Sabata who piloted or captained Willem Blauvelt's prize, the Spanish ship called the Tabasco. He brought the Tabasco to New Amsterdam in August of 1649. Unfortunately for Sabata and Blauvelt, the prize was captured after the Dutch and the Spanish signed a treaty ending the 80-year war between the two countries. Therefore, the prize was deemed illegal, and years of court battles ensued. One of the main problems was the lag in communications between Europe and the West Indies. And even if the colonial authorities were notified they had no way to communicate with the ships at sea. Neither Captain Blauvelt nor the Spanish in the West Indies knew about the peace treaty of 1648 until the summer of 1649. Now, after Campo Sabata delivered the Tabasco, the Spanish ship, to New Amsterdam, he didn't stay in New Amsterdam for very long. On 27 August 1649, Campo signed a power of attorney that said he was about to depart on a voyage to the north. Campo Sabata's destination, other than north, was not mentioned in the power of attorney, but from the records, we find that he appeared in Pequot, the Native American name for New London, Connecticut, where he received one of the original town lots in 1650-51. Campo Sabata carried on shipping business in New London. He also maintained a log house trading post on Block Island, where he conducted trade with the Indians who had a settlement there. Sabata's live-in agents at the trading post, William Baker and his wife, were the first white residents on Block Island. Then, in April of 1653, John Winthrop Jr., the founder of New London and the first governor of Connecticut, commissioned Sabata to bring bread and other supplies into the town. On his return voyage, self-styled vigilantes took possession of Sabata's ship as a Dutch prize. In Europe, the First Anglo-Dutch War had erupted in 1652. It seemed like they were constantly making peace treaties and constantly fighting each other. But this First Anglo-Dutch War had its effects in America. The English colonists thought the war gave them license to seize an enemy Dutch vessel. Campo Sabata took his case to court. Unfortunately, the case became very complicated. The prize was sold and resold, and the identity of the vigilantes was uncertain. In addition, there were questions about court jurisdiction. The case was not resolved until Sabata's ship was finally judged to be an illegal prize because it was seized without a commission. So you see, there was clearly a legal distinction between privateering and piracy. Now, it's unlikely that Campo Sabata appreciated the irony of having his ship seized illegally and declared a prize, because only a few years earlier, he had piloted the illegally seized Tabasco to New Amsterdam. In any case, after his case was settled, he decided to return to the West Indies, where his skills and expertise were more appreciated. Meanwhile, Captain Willem Albertsen Blauvelt had remained in New Netherland after 1649, hoping to recover at least some of the booty from his prize Tabasco. He spent most of his time in Fort Orange, which is today's Albany, New York. After the treaty between the Dutch and Spain, Captain Blauvelt would no longer receive commissions from the Dutch in New Amsterdam to prey upon Spanish ships. Furthermore, the legal disposition of Willem's prize captured in 1649 was unsettled and remained unresolved in the courts into the mid-1650s. While Captain Blauvelt waited to claim his share of the prize, he apparently decided to earn some money from the shipping trade on the Hudson River. In 1654, a few months before he left New Netherland to go back to the West Indies, He leased his boat for 2 months for the service of General Petrus Stuyvesant. But it was in the court records of Fort Orange that we learned that Willem Albertsen Blauvelt came from Monnikendam in the Netherlands. Monnikendam was a small seaport city north of Amsterdam on what was called the Zuiderzee. Beyond that, we know nothing of his early life. His career can be broken up into 3 time periods, or at least I did. I broke it up into 3 time periods. During the first period, from the 1620s to 1640, he was primarily located in the Caribbean Sea in the area of Providence Island and the Mosquito Coast of Central America. And the Mosquito Coast of Central America is the Caribbean coast of today's Honduras and Nicaragua. From 1641 to about 1655, Captain Blauvelt operated out of New Netherland, the Dutch colony in North America. Then from 1655 into the 1660s, he was back in the Caribbean, this time in and around the island of Jamaica. During the times he was in the Caribbean, before and after he was operating out of New Netherland, he worked primarily as a privateer for the English. In the 1630s, he worked for the English Providence Island Company, and in the 1660s, he worked for the English government in Jamaica. And it was the English who called him Bluefield, the English translation of his Dutch name, Blauvelt. And it's interesting that we may have never known that Captain Willem Albertsen was a Blauvelt if he had not worked for the English. The Dutch commonly identified themselves at that time with only their patronymic, their father's name. Willem was the son of Albert, therefore he was known as Willem Albertsen. The use of a surname was optional for the Dutch. But for the English, surnames were more important. Middle names were optional. Just as in our own case. So the English identified Willem Albertsen as Willem Blauvelt, and then translated it to Willem or William Bluefields. And it's interesting to note that during the time that Willem was in Fort Orange among the Dutch, he reverted to the common practice and was mostly found in the records as simply Willem Albertsen. Now, there are 2 geographic locations in the Caribbean named Bluefields. One in Nicaragua, where you can find the city of Bluefields, Bluefields River, and Bluefields Bay. The other is in Jamaica, where there is the town of Bluefields, Bluefields Beach, and another Bluefields Bay. In the 17th century, the entire southwest coastal area of Jamaica was called Bluefields Parish or County. These places with the name Bluefields were a testament to the exploits and the fame of Captain Blauvelt. However, Willem Albertsen has to share the honor, at least for the places in Nicaragua, with his father, Albert. Albert was perhaps the first to explore the Mosquito Coast of Central America and the neighboring islands. Now let's take a look at some of these places I've been talking about here. Here's a map of the Western Caribbean, and Cuba here at the top, and of course Florida is just north of that. And over here you can see is Bluefields on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. And not too far away, right over here, is Providence Island, where the Providence Island Company established an English colony. And then there's Cape Gracias a Dios over here on the coast. And it got its name supposedly from Columbus. When Columbus was first exploring this area, he got caught in a terrible storm. It might have been a hurricane. But as he rounded the Cape, it suddenly became very quiet. And Columbus said, "Gracias a Dios," thanks to God. So this cape has been called Cape Gracias a Dios since that time. Okay, then the Mosquito Coast that I mentioned, and the Mosquito Keys. That's this entire area along the coast here, on the eastern coast of Central America. And this is where the Mosquito Indians, Native American Indians, lived. And then we have Jamaica over here. Notice the only thing in Jamaica that's identified is Kingston, which in Captain Blauvelt's time didn't even exist. And then finally, the Bay of Campeche. This was where Captain Blauvelt captured the Tabasco, and it's this was Mexico, and it was called New Spain at that time. All right, let's get a closer look at the Mosquito Coast in this next slide. This is a map from 1864. And down here, it's called Bluefields Lagoon. Bluefields Bay is called Bluefields Lagoon. And here's Bluefields River. And up here is Cape Gracias a Dios. And this place is important because the last recorded document of Willem Blauvelt, he was living among the Indians here. He was still counted among the English buccaneers of Jamaica, but at the time they took this survey, there was about a dozen English buccaneers that were active in 1663, I think it was, and he was living here among the Indians. But he had been friends with these Indians since the 1620s. But this Mosquito Coast was long dominated by the British. It was a British protectorate and known as the Mosquito Kingdom. It was like a separate country. And from 1860, the area was transferred to Nicaragua. But then in 1960, the northern part of the Mosquito Kingdom here was granted to Honduras. Now let's take a little closer look at this map. This blue area up here is Honduras, and they received the northern part of the Mosquito Kingdom, and Nicaragua is this yellow country who received the rest of it. Okay, we can take a little closer look. Oh, the boundary between Honduras on the north here and Nicaragua on the south begins here at Cape Gracias a Dios, and this river forms the current day boundary between Nicaragua and Honduras on the north. Okay, a little closer look at this is the same map from 1864. Here we see Bluefields Lagoon, and notice that Bluefields is spelled B-L-E-W. And here's Bluefields River emptying into the bay. Yeah, and one more map here this is from 1794 of Bluefield Bay. Here it's called Bluefields Harbor. And Bluefields on this map is spelled both ways. Here it's Bluefields, B-L-U-E, and here it's Bluefields, B-L-E-W. Over here is the Bluefields River emptying into the bay. And notice over here, they indicate that there are English colonists living there. And here is Bluefields Bluff. It's near the entrance to the bay from the Caribbean. But right there is a sandbar. And if your ship was small enough, you could enter the harbor. But if your ship was big, like the big Spanish ships at that time, you couldn't get beyond the sandbar. So it was an ideal hiding place for the buccaneers. Okay, now let's take a look at Jamaica. This is Jamaica in 1672. A new government came into power, and it was in 1664 that the island was divided into these political entities that they called parishes. They were like counties in Jamaica. And in 1664, this southwestern coast of Jamaica was called Bluefields Parish. But then in 1672, another government took over and they changed the name to St. Elizabeth Parish. Most of the other parishes were saints' names. I also want to point out the area of Kingston. Kingston's not even on this map in 1672. On the northern part of this big harbor here. At that time, the main city was called Port Royal, and that's where most of the buccaneers of Jamaica used to hang out. But of course, Willem Blauvelt hung out over here. Let's get a closer look at that. Here's St. Elizabeth Parish that was formerly Bluefields Parish. And right over here is Bluefields Bay. All right. Now, other than descriptions of Captain Blauvelt's capture of the Tabasco in 1649 from court records, we have very little documentary evidence of Captain Blauvelt's activities and exploits as a privateer. But we know he captured many Spanish ships and brought them back to New Amsterdam because it's in the Dutch records from New Amsterdam. But we don't know exactly where or how he captured them. Other famous buccaneers became well known because their careers, even if relatively short, were documented and publicized. Henry Morgan, for example, operated out of Jamaica in the 1660s. But he had a publicist on board his ship. His name was Alexander Olivier Esquemelin. And he was a confidant of Morgan. And he wrote the book, The Buccaneers of America, that became a standard primary source about the buccaneers of the Caribbean. He described Morgan's large expeditions leading dozens of ships into battle. Henry Morgan's sack of Panama City in 1671 was his greatest and most celebrated expedition. When the news spread, he became a celebrity in England as well as in Jamaica, and a man of infamy in Spain. But notice that despite Henry Morgan's fame, there aren't any places in the West Indies named Morgan Bay or Morgan River. One of the more interesting things I learned during my research was called the Jamaica Discipline, or the law of the privateers. It was a tradition with a distinctive conception of justice and a class hostility to shipmasters, owners, and gentlemen adventurers. It also featured democratic controls on authority and provision for the injured. With regard to provision for the injured, it was stipulated in writing what was awarded to anyone who was wounded or suffered the loss of any limb during an expedition. For the loss of a right arm, 600 pieces of 8 or 6 slaves was awarded. For the loss of a left arm, 500 pieces of 8. For a left leg, 400 pieces of 8, and so forth, down to the loss of a finger. Even the terms of enslavement were regulated. The slaves were usually the crew members of captured ships whose lives were spared in exchange for a period of enslavement. And this was usually 3 years, after which they were freed. Now, historians have tried to explain these codes of conduct among the buccaneers. And it's speculated that it was likely related to the struggles of ordinary sailors in revolutionary England in the 1640s and 50s, their struggles over subsistence, wages, and rights, and against impressment and violent discipline. And I don't think ordinary sailors in Spain or elsewhere had it any better. Men were picked up off the streets, thrown into a ship that became their prison, and they were forced to live in cramped, unsanitary condition for months on end. However, in opposition to the prevailing status quo, the ordinary seamen among the buccaneers in America began building a tradition of their own. Here's a brief description of pirate traditions from the book, The Many-Headed Hydra by Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker. I quote, "The pirate ship was democratic in an undemocratic age. The pirates allowed their captain unquestioned authority in chase and in battle, but otherwise insisted that he be governed by the majority. Limitations on the captain's power were embodied in the person of the quartermaster, who was elected to represent and protect the interests of the crew. Furthermore, the institution of the ship's council that included every man on the ship always constituted the ultimate authority. The pirate ship was also egalitarian in a hierarchical age. Pirates divided their plunder equally, leveling the elaborate structure of pay ranks common to all other maritime employments. Captain and quartermaster received 1.5 to 2 shares of plunder. Minor officers and craftsmen were given 1.25 or 1.5, and all others got 1 share equal each. Now I'll give you an example of a pirate crew overruling their captain. I found this story in a book by Daniel Defoe called A General History of the Pirates, which was first published in 1724. Daniel Defoe is best known as the author of Robinson Crusoe. But this story describes a pirate captain, Bellamy, in his cruise off Rhode Island in April of 1717, just 7 years before Defoe wrote his book. Bellamy captured a sloop commanded by a Captain Beer from Boston. Bellamy took Captain Beard on board his ship while his crew plundered Beer's vessel. Bellamy had proposed returning the sloop to Captain Beer, but the crew objected and overruled Captain Bellamy and ended up sinking the sloop. Captain Bellamy explained the situation to Captain Beer. He cursed his crew and apologized to Captain Beer, but the sloop had to be sunk. All right, now before I finish, I have 2 more pictures to show you. Some colorful pictures. The first is, this is Bluefields Beach in Jamaica. And of course, this is Bluefields Bay. The town of Bluefields is in this area to the north. And this last picture is Bluefields, Nicaragua, and Bluefields Bay. This is the city of Bluefields on the west coast of the bay. This is Bluefields Bay. And you can see this little strip of land here. On the other side of this strip of land is the Caribbean. And way down here to the south is the entrance to the bay from the Caribbean. Okay, so that's some of the things I learned while researching Captain Willem Albertsen Blauvelt. And there's more in the book. I guess you can see it over my shoulder here. And if you're interested, you can get copies at Amazon, or any bookstore can order it for you. We still have some time for questions, but on this video presentation, there's no way you can ask and no way I can answer. So, have a good evening.